This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Frances Beatty, Managing Director of the Ray Johnson Estate. Known for his masterful use of collage, Johnson was a key figure in the 50s pop art scene, as well as a pioneer in the areas of conceptualism, performance art, and mail art. Beatty takes time to discuss Ray Johnson's colorful life and the impact that he had on the art icons and everyday people in his social network. No longer overlooked, Johnson has become a popular subject of academic research whose stature in the canon of 20th century art history continues to grow. And now, a conversation all about Ray Johnson with Frances Beatty. Frances Beatty, thank you for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Frances, you're the managing director of the Ray Johnson Estate, and there is an upcoming exhibit coming up at Bloom in Los Angeles, eponymously called Ray Johnson, March 16th to May 4th. And Frances, I wanted to have a conversation with you about Ray Johnson, and about the exhibit. But when we started scratching away at the surface of who Ray Johnson was, it's such an interesting conversation. Frances, I know it's a very simple question, but I know it's a hard one to answer. Who was Ray Johnson?
Ray Johnson was one of the most important, significant artists of the second half of the 20th century. He was a seminal pop artist, a conceptualist, one of the first performance artists, and one of the most, I think, polymorphous of all the artists who were his contemporaries, which were Warhol, Rauschenberg, also Merce Cunningham, Cage, Jasper Johns, that group. And he has this funny thing attached to his name very often, being called the most famous unknown artist, which I don't think he really is unknown at all anymore. But he was resolutely uninterested in furthering his commercial career, while at the same time establishing this giant mail art network that expands even today. So he was born in Detroit, and he went to art school there. And then in 1945, he got a scholarship to the famous Black Mountain College, where all of these artists gathered and were taught by Albers. And that was kind of like the cradle of the American avant-garde of the 50s, 60s, 70s. And they learned all about Dadaism, Surrealism, abstract art, everything in Black Mountain. And then he went to New York City, where he was first an abstract artist, and then quickly he started making collages and also invented mail art and did performances. And he was really in the kind of center of the mix. In 1957, actually, there was a review in Art News of a Jasper Johns show, which mentioned if Jasper Johns, and then such as his better known colleagues, such as Ray Johnson, Rauschenberg, and Capra. So Ray Johnson is somebody who was always embedded in the art world in New York. So in the 1950s, he was making these incredible dense collages made up of images from everything from the media to telephone conversation, which he would pack into them. And he famously used James Dean and Elvis Presley in his collages in 1957, 5 years before his great friend, Andy Warhol, used them in a much, much larger format and in a different way. But Henry Geldzahler called them the Plymouth Rock of pop art. Ray, true to Ray's sense of humor, always said, I don't make pop art, I make chop art, because he would chop all of these things up and recycle them in order to make his collages. And the collages were, in many ways, a kind of quintessential late 20th, early 21st century medium, because assembling all these images, we're bombarded with all kinds of disparate images all the time. So the collages are, even though they're very small, they're packed with all kinds of information, and it's always assembled with artfulness and also, I would say, a wonderful kind of mischievous irony, which always accompanies Ray Johnson's work. Ray was part of the New York art scene. He had a number of terrific shows at important galleries, Marion Willard, Betty Parsons, Richard Vigan, in the late 60s. In the early 60s, he seemed to have spent a lot of time chopping up things because we don't have a lot of work, but he ramped up something called his mail art network, in which he started sending out these like letters to people with all kinds of information in them. And then he started to write, please send to, or please return to, which meant that the recipient would send them on or send them back to Ray, and he would send them somewhere else. So this was another kind of artistic practice, but it was one that circumvented the commercial world. So you couldn't buy or sell the mail art. And in fact, if Ray found out that you sold some mail art, something that he sent you, he would issue a fatwa against you and say, this person is now dead, in the next mail or whatever, because this was one of his ways of circulating art in this kind of free and ever-expanding way. So he's also revered by a lot of very contemporary artists. And also there's been a lot written about this being prescient and its relationship to our own network. What would have Ray done with a computer? But so that's part of his practice. And then he also did performances, which he called nothings instead of calling them performances. And again, wonderful irony, but also reflective of Zen, in which nothing is also everything. But he was one of the first performance artists, and periodically he would do these performances. He would also, the New York Correspondence School was the name that he gave to this mail art network, which is hilarious. Think of it, because at the time, the 50s, first people would actually have correspondence schools,
Right.
And this is actually not a school. It was a kind of virtual school. So sometimes he'd call meetings of the olive oil fan club, or the Rodin fan club, or something like that. And sometimes there would be a meeting, and sometimes there wouldn't be a meeting.
As we look at Ray and in his life, he makes a lot of interesting decisions on where his place in the art world is going to be, right? Because It's interesting to hear conversations with people who were attempting to work with Ray on a business level in terms of trying to represent Ray or trying to purchase artwork from Ray. And it's oftentimes those conversations almost sound like Abbott and Costello's Who's on First.
Yes.
Can you kind of describe that?
Well, I think that Ray, in the late 60s, and the early 70s, when he actually had some exhibitions, Richard Feigen, who I worked with in the 80s, said that he was from another planet and he was absolutely impossible to deal with. He actually, though, convinced Richard Feigen, who was quite parsimonious, to rent a helicopter so that he could throw hot dogs down on avant-garde people who were waiting on Staten Island in the avant-garde festival. So, I mean, you can imagine an artist who, sort of wants you to do something like this in the 70s, being kind of elusive. When I finally, in 1968, when Valerie Solana shot Andy Warhol, Ray went to live out in Locust Valley, which is not a hotbed of kind of an artist community. And he became more and more kind of withdrawn in the sense that he wasn't appearing in commercial venues so much, but he kept on this vast network. So he would kind of dart in and out of the limelight. But by the time I started trying to have a Ray Johnson show in 1980, there was no way you could do a Ray Johnson show. I would talk to Ray. We were very friendly. I would talk to him endlessly. And then he'd call me up and I'd say, well, Ray, can't we do a show at Castelli, Feigen, Corcoran, which was the gallery that Richard Feigen and Leo Castelli and Jim Corcoran had together. And he'd say, I'll get back to you. And then he'd call me and he said, I've got the show. I said, oh, great, Ray. What are we going to do? He said, we're going to do a nothing. And I said, Ray, I thought this was really clever of me. I said, Ray, we're uptown. We can't do nothing. If we were downtown, maybe we could do nothing. But he laughed and went on. Peter Schuth famously tried to buy a work from him. So they were negotiating. Peter picked out the work, and I can't remember the price. I think it's in the film. But let's say Ray said, I want $6,000. Peter said, well, how about $4,000? And then Ray said, okay, well, give it back to me and I'll send it to you. So he sent it to Peter Schuth with a quarter of it cut out. That was what it was like to deal with Ray Johnson. And so it was just in the 80s and the 90s before he backstroked out to sea, committing suicide in a kind of very performative way in 1995, it was impossible to do a show of Ray. In fact, before Ray died, he called me and said, I'm going to do something. And he laughed, this wonderful laugh, and said, and you'll be able to have your show, Frances, which I had no idea at that point what that meant. But indeed, after that, we had a big memorial show for Ray 2 months after he died.
So how did that work? Were you notified that you would have access to what was in the house, and just opening up the house, that was a whole other experience in terms of what you found and how that was organized, right?
Yeah. Well, the memorial show I borrowed from all these incredible characters who were friends of Ray's, also from people like Jasper Johns, who owned Ray's work, and a number of collectors who had bought it early on, before he really stopped selling it in commercial venues. So that was the memorial show. The house was totally another trip because it was clearly left. He knew well, people would go in there, and I'm sure he knew that I would go in there. And so there were all these little kind of clues and sort of things left around. There were, there'd be a rock with a bunny head. And as you walked into one room, there was a photograph of Chuck Close's photograph of him staring right at you. And I remember looking at all this stuff and thinking, I was trying to think of how to, organize it and keep it. And I actually went into the to the basement, and there was a snow shovel. And Ray was a very kind of is called the heir to Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp did this famous ready-made of a snow shovel. And so I looked at Ray's snow shovel and I thought, Ray, you are messing with me. I don't know whether this is just a snow shovel or this is your, Marcel Duchamp lookalike, right. In addition to all the collages. So, Ray was always messing with you and challenging you to see more and see all of the kind of double or triple things that were going on. If you saw Ray and you had, if I saw Ray and I had a red dress on, 2 days later, he'd send me something that had to do with feet. Why? Because red, tomato, toe, feet. So you had to kind of surf on these kinds of connections, because whenever Ray looked at something, he took it apart. He'd take the image, he'd think of the word describing the image, and he'd take both of them apart. You can see him do this in his collages. He takes them apart and then sees where they go, what they suggest. So it's this incredible trip that you go on when you look at Ray Johnson's collages. And the more you look at them, the more you kind of travel in this world of kind of interconnection.
I remember hearing him say that he was surprised that those avant-gardes were actually trying to eat the hot dogs that he had dropped out of the helicopter. He was like, I never considered that somebody would actually want to eat the hot dogs. Like, don't they understand that the reason I was dropping foot-long hot dogs was because I was currently doing a body of work about feet? And like
exactly.
It's like, that's very Ray.
Would not eat a hot dog, is a completely Ray thought.
I was listening to an interesting conversation in preparation with someone who had been doing research, an art historian, and that they had a really interesting perspective, and they were looking at the social networking that the correspondence school was creating. And the context of the time, how that social networking, it kind of goes hand in hand with the whole concept of 6 degrees of separation that was a new idea in that time. And so even the way that Ray would give the instructions, it's almost as if he was doing a social experiment to see how far he could reach. But that reach was also scary to somebody like the FBI during the Lavender Scare, because, given Ray's sexual orientation, there was fear that what was being secretly sent through the mail was something subversive or counterculture or pornographic.
Well, first of all, the network, was this free floating, and it exploded. A lot of the Fluxus people, of course, embraced that kind of network. There were a lot of artists started writing letters But Ray reached as far as Japan, Germany, and it was this way of connecting all of these artists and non-artists, which I think is a very key part of it. In the archive, we have some class in I don't know, Missouri or something, got a hold of one of his flyers, and every single member of the high school class made something and sent it back to Ray Johnson. So this is this wonderful kind of democratic way of connecting people, which is very different from the collages, which are very, very beautifully, intensely worked. I mean, they aren't ripped and torn. They're very, very constructed, painted, drawn, sanded, that kind of thing. But in terms of and there's just been a book that came out called Queer Networks. Mm-hmm. This is kind of the year of, I think this is the sort of year of Ray Johnson. There are like 2 books that were published last year. There are 3 books coming up. Caitlin Haskell at the Art Institute of Chicago, who did a huge, fabulous show on Ray Johnson and wrote a catalog called Ray Johnson Care Of, which is one of the great art books of our time. I mean, the New York Times said so. And it was runner-up for the Alice Award. And it is just one of the most extraordinary objects as a book. Anyway, they're digitizing this archive at the Art Institute of Chicago, and they're going to release it in August. And you're going to, worldwide, people will be able to search 20,000 pages of Ray Johnson material. So the network is going to explode in yet again. In terms of the being subversive, I mean, I think that Ray, you know, a lot of his generation were gay. Some of them were married, some of them had children. And so there was this, I think, awareness, obviously, of their being regarded as being subversive, not just artistically, but socially, and of those 2 things kind of interconnecting. And I think Ray totally, you know, embraces it. I mean, he doesn't seem to be afraid of I mean, he kind of does what he does, and in some ways, it kind of, this is a sort of felicitous thing as opposed to the FBI knocking on your door. There's a collage of Ray lined up, and it's clearly he's being interviewed to go into the Army. Mm-hmm. And apparently, when he was interviewed to be into the Army, they examined him, and they they gave him a 4F or whatever it was. This was in the 50s, not in the Vietnam mm-hmm. era. And they said he had a heart murmur. And he was like, wow, no one ever told me I had a heart murmur. And he went to, I don't know, you know, one of those bars down in the Lower East Side about 2 weeks later and ran into a bunch of his friends who had also been in the recruitment office. And they were also all gay. And they said, you know, they told me I had a heart murmur and they wouldn't take me. And Ray figured that the Army doctors, their way of eliminating this group was to tell them they had heart murmurs. So I'm like, wow, that is a really great result of, you know, being theoretically unacceptable, that you don't have to be in the Army.
Yeah, but it seems very Ray, though, because there's something poetic about your your heart is a little bit different. So you're not man enough to be in our army. It's almost like that would inspire him to make something.
Absolutely. This is what is so great about talking about Ray. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I mean, I've thought about this a lot and I hadn't thought about it. So it's one of the just incredible rewards of having a conversation with anything that has to do with Ray is people point out things to you all the time that didn't even occur to you.
Well, it's really interesting when you watch How to Draw a Bunny or other video that's out there, and you just see all the faces of the art world's 20th century just speak in such reverence of Ray, whether that's Christo and Jean-Claude or Chuck Close, or one piece I was listening to yesterday had Lawrence Weiner, and Lawrence was just speaking just so highly of Ray. And he was saying Ray carried on conversations with people in the art world nonstop, in that he was constantly exchanging ideas and challenging people. It was almost like he was providing critiques. And Lawrence Weiner was talking about how he was almost serving as a conscience of the art world. But at the same time, he said, he almost was serving as the art world's jester also. And I think it's very interesting.
I think that the jester thing is because he saw the humor in everything. I mean, he saw layers and layers of kind of how ironic something is. For example, he did these dollar bill collages, and he put a $1 bill in the middle of the collage. Of course, the $1 bill ironically says, "In God we trust," which is actually in the dollar bill we trust, right? Or maybe in the gold we trust. Or is the artwork worth money, or is it spiritual? I mean, just that particular gesture amongst lots of other gestures is as thought provoking and also kind of wonderfully hilarious at the same time. So I think that it was because he was just so damn funny. While he was critiquing, he was so kind of like spot on all the time. So he wasn't silly funny, he was like smart funny.
It's also very interesting to see the footage. He had a filmmaker come alongside him and document some of his time out on Long Island, going to parties, going to different events. And it's just, there's a hilarity to how he would interact with people. The fact that he was bringing his film crew along with him when he would have to explain to people who he was and his context. There would always be a point where he would kind of stop and break the fourth wall and look at the camera to see, listen to this, judge this. Are they buying it? Are they, watch how their cogs are turning, It's very funny, and it makes you wonder how much of his life was a performance. Like every day, it just seemed like he viewed his entire life as a piece of art, and every interaction was part of that.
It's funny. Billy Name says in the How to Draw a Bunny, he says, lots of other people make art. Ray was a work of art. And then someone asked him if Ray took drugs, and he said, Ray didn't take drugs. Ray was where we took drugs to get to.
Right.
I think he wasn't performing. He was just like 110% a kind of work of art, work of performance, work of literature, work of drama. His, this incredibly active mind was just going all the time, which is one of the reasons I think that when Ray really stopped exhibiting in commercial venues, when Ray died, he had $400,000 in his bank account. He owned this little house and he was making his work. So he really didn't have to sell anything. And I think maybe he got that amount of money, which was a lot in 1995, and certainly enough for him to, make his art and buy the stamps to mail things out and make collages. But I think he got it from an aunt who died and sold her house. He was an only child. So at that point, he really didn't have to sell anything. You could see he was just far too busy thinking and making and doing to go out and, show in a commercial gallery, which would have been sort of distract him from what he was doing all the time.
He removes himself from the middle of that New York art scene. I mean, can we presume it was because it got a little crazy? But I mean, I guess it also, do I remember that Richard Lippold also moved out to Locust Valley?
Living out in Locust Valley with his family, and they had always had a relationship. And so he was there in this house near to Richard Lippold. At some point but I think Ray really, it wasn't that he left something. He was going. He said, I moved to this house with a Joseph Cornell attic. I think he used to visit Joseph Cornell, and Joseph Cornell famously had a basement in which he had all of his stuff, all that stuff that he would use to make boxes. And so when Ray says a Joseph Cornell attic, I sort of think he's in this place where he's moving, he's got all of his stuff, and he can keep on using it, chopping it up, making all these things, sending out all this mailing, etc. And he's really able to do that in that context. And if he wants to connect, he can go into a party. I met him at a party for Louise Nevelson in New York in the early 1970s. And I was just captivated by him. And I saw this show that he did at Brooks Jackson Yolas, and I wrote a review of it. And so he started sending me stuff. But he would call people up all the time. And so he was connected, but he didn't want to go. I mean, he didn't want to go out and be a celebrity, even though he was fascinated by and a lot of those collages that are in the Blum show sort of show you his kind of view of celebrity, what he does artistically around celebrity, which is kind of what he does around, the dollar bill and God we trust. I mean, it's always got a lot of different layers of meaning, which are kind of really fascinating. It's like when he does James Dean and shows him weeping by, adding drips down his face. So I sort of think it's like yin and yang to Andy Warhol, who he was very close to, and who he actually introduced to Billy Name, who then created the whole silver decor of the factory. And you were talking about artists. Ruth Asawa writes in a letter that Ray Johnson was the smartest artist she'd ever met. So, I mean, he and she was also one of his great friends at Black Mountain College, and somebody he corresponded with throughout his life. So I think the art community of that era, was aware of Ray. But in the 80s and 90s, when everybody was getting famous and art became really about big prices, big images, big celebrity, he was like, that's not for me.
Art history isn't always written in an artist's lifetime. It's not always written in the decade after an artist's passing, but art history has a tendency to right wrongs in balance scales over time. So often we have a preclination to what are market prices during an artist's lifetime. But if all the art historians are doing their job correctly, it's possible in 100 years, Ray's Namaker as being the most famous unknown artist would be a real mystery to someone thinking, well, how could Ray Johnson have been unknown?
I think he's no longer, I mean, if you can't find I don't think you can find an artist, the contemporary artists love Ray Johnson. I mean, I hear that Richard Prince loves Ray Johnson. I mean, the artists know Ray Johnson. And if you there, as I said, there have been 6 books about Ray Johnson in the last 4 years. There's this big project at the Art Institute of Chicago, and but I think that very often the public thinks that price makes something important, and that's not always true. I mean, we now have a whole catch up I just went to see the Harlem Renaissance show at the Met, in which we have a whole lot of artists who, no one was thinking about at all 20 years. And the kind of collector's world seems to pay much more attention to something's, the price of something. But I think that we certainly, and now we see Blum's doing this show. Craig Starr is doing the show in New York. I think that the beat of the tom toms are certainly around Ray, but it's a different kind of thing because it's not a giant painting that you can put over your sofa. But on the other hand, it's something that is more affordable and you can find space for. So
Sure.
and it's so rewarding.
So I would love to talk a little bit more about the estate in your work and just trying to catalog and archive and authenticate, because and when you stop and think about it, it seems like it would be challenging to try to catalog and archive and authenticate, the mail art, because some of this work he would send it off, it would be collaborated on by somebody else. So there's a question of authorship. Then he would get something back and hold on to it for 20 years and send it out again. So there are questions about what was created when, and the reworking, and how do we even start to unpack some of these things?
Well, as I said, Ray, the mail art is something whenever people bring us mail art, and there are people who have, there was this big archive acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago that belonged to Bill Wilson, which was their digitizing this giant process. But if people bring me Ray Johnson mail art, I say, and they want me to authenticate it, I say that's completely counterintuitive to everything that Ray did. And I'm certainly not authenticating mail art because it's supposed to be a mode of exchange between different people, and it's not supposed to be monetized. And so it's authenticity. If you have a Ray Johnson archive and a group of things, there are people I know who do buy and sell mail art, which, is okay, I guess. But I prefer for it to be in archives, and then it should be donated to a museum. Or if you have a whole pile of it, then you can get an appraisal and you can donate it to a museum. But the idea of authenticating a piece of mail art is laughable.
Right.
I'm kidding. And then some people would bring me mail art, and they have, it's Ray in the later years would make like these templates, and it said Ray Johnson collages $1 million each, already. He'd send out hundreds and hundreds of them. Well, then somebody else had to write on them, right? Or maybe if he wrote something on them. I mean, the estate is resolutely not authenticating mail art. The collages are a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm.
They made collages, had them framed during his lifetime, had shows of them, and they were collages that he left in his estate. And those we're confident are 100% Ray Johnson, and they're works of art.
Right.
A mail art work is a different animal. So it's like selling a performance.
Right.
I'm not going to sell a Ray Johnson performance, but so that is something. Collages we do. There was someone who was kind of faking small Ray Johnson collages, and he put them onto eBay and selling them, and it was driving us crazy. So I actually had an old friend who used to be in the FBI in their art recovery program, who would find Modigliani fakes that were selling for $10 million or $100 million. And I asked him to help me because eBay wouldn't. And he actually somehow found this guy and, kind of told him to cease and desist. But that was kind of definitely a very Ray Johnson experience. Somebody who was deliberately faking early envelopes very lovingly, I have to add. Paper and all kinds of things that, he was trying to imitate the things from the 50s.
I wonder how Ray would have felt about that. If he would have loved it or hated it.
I think he would have loved it. Yeah, he would have loved it. Because, I just thought, I don't want people to be thinking that, I don't want them to kind of think because they're paying money for it.
Right.
If they had it and, they treasured it, that would be something else. It would be like their own mail art that came from, some person in Germany who got it from Ray Johnson, who added to it, who sent it to them, who sent it to someone else, and then they've got it.
The show is coming up, Bloom Gallery in Los Angeles, March 16th to May 4th. What can people expect to see when they go to Bloom Gallery next month?
They're going to see a wonderful group, including some very early, beautiful, kind of exquisite, very much more spare Ray Johnsons, right through things that are incredibly rich. There's a Mark Rothko and a Ray Johnson inscribed the names of people, often artists, most of the time people who either died tragically or by their own hand or in some Jackson Pollock, this, that, and the other. And they're kind of inscribed on some of these very dense, rich collages. There is a lot of imagery. Ray Johnson did a group of collages that he called movie stars, in which they stand up, and there was an exhibit of some of them at the Morgan Library, in which they're actually images of all different kinds of movie stars, from Janet Leigh to James Dean to River Phoenix, that kind of thing. Anyway, there are a number of references. We thought that would be kind of fun to movie stars and celebrity in this show. So I think it'll give you as much as anything can, like a really good sampling, a rich sampling of Ray Johnson's own work, and a variety of this very kind of fascinating subject matter, which is kind of all over.
So, Frances, is there anything else coming up besides the exhibit in Los Angeles that Ray Johnson fans may be interested in?
Well, the exhibition at Craig Starr in New York is going to have a catalog. Also, there's going to be a huge book published by Karma sometime this year of 400 photographs of Ray Johnson's and essays. There's going to be the reissue of a catalog that was done at the North Carolina Museum of Art. That's a catalog of mail art. Again, Xeroxes of letters of Ray Johnson, loose leaf, in a book. So it'll be this kind of wonderful object book. And then a scholar, Ellen Levy, is publishing her book on Ray Johnson, which is just an amazing tome. And she's been working on it for 7 years, and it's really fun to read. It's going to be published by MIT Press, and it'll also, I think, win tons of awards. And that's going to come out maybe November, December at the end of the year. So there's a lot happening.
Wow. And if folks wanted to follow the work that you're doing at the estate, is the best place to follow along at rayjohnsоnestate.com, or is there social media, or how's the best way to keep an eye on the work that you guys do?
The Ray Johnson Estate website is like a giant library of Ray Johnson. It's not a selling site at all. It is really, we have downloaded articles from the Village Voice from 1955. We have a glossary telling you what a bunny head is, and what a bodicose is. It has got a huge timeline. So, and we regularly post articles that have been written about Ray. We have a link to the film and a link to Jared Ernst did this wonderful essay about Ray from a queer perspective called What a Dump, which we have a link to. So the estate website is really a treasure trove of information ongoing about Ray.
Well, Frances, I really, really appreciate your time today. And I feel like any conversation about Ray can go on for 2 or 3 hours. I feel like we're still just scratching the surface. And I really appreciate you taking time out to talk to us. And I hope folks are all able to, especially on the West Coast. I'm not sure how much Ray Johnson the West Coast has had the opportunity to see in person, but to be able to go out to Bloom Gallery March 16th to May 4th to see the Ray Johnson exhibit, Frances, I really appreciate your time.
It was so much fun. It's the most fun to talk about Ray Johnson because you always learn something. Also in the show are 2 sort of sculptural works, and they've never been seen in public at all. So there are things that, a lot of things in that show that are, this is the first time they will be seen by the public. So I'm sure that people will appreciate that.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.